one thing I want to do to demonstrate the concepts today is introduce two of my favorite children. They're fictitious children, but it helps me to explain the differences between the children we're raising that have very difficult to severe behaviors versus the kid next door or your sister's child or your brother's child. And so we're going to start by introducing Andy. Andy's your basic average, I don't like using normal, but you know what I'm saying. The average child is Andy. By the picture here, what do we know about Andy? He's grown up in a very calm environment, very predictable environment. He's got a two-parent family. Things have been really stable. Mom had a great pregnancy. The delivery was great. There's been no medical trauma, right? There are kids like this in the world, aren't there? Right. So Andy, when he goes into first grade or second grade, guess how he does? Pretty well. He's like programmed for school. He's loving it. He gets up out of bed in the morning. He gets on the bus and he arrives and says, "Hi, Mrs. Smith." Now, is this your child? No. What do we have? We have Billy. Okay? What do we know about Billy from the picture here? We have Billy who has trauma, right? Something happened along the way. And it could have been in utero. It could have been at the delivery. It could have been a medical experience. It could have been a divorce in the family. We minimize divorce. Divorce is it's the death of a family. And it does have an impact on children, absolutely. That's relationship trauma. That's the family system that's supposed to be safe and secure has collapsed. And yes, there's ways to work with kids, and I'm not saying, sometimes it's the best thing to happen, but from the child's perspective, it is trauma. And to never minimize that. But he might have had, neglect and abuse, and we're going to go through the list of this in a minute. But what I want us to recognize is that he's had trauma somewhere in that history. So when he goes to second grade or first grade, he can't even get up out of bed in the morning, right? He can't even get on the bus without slamming the kid next to him. And he gets to school, and he gives Mrs. Jones the finger. Right? Where did you learn? You don't learn that from Barney. These are the experiences that he learned from his past. So we have to work with where he is at and understand his perspective. So let's look at this whole idea of trauma. Okay, so I said that we're going to have some fun today. Do you like games? Who likes games? I like games. All right. Do you like Jeopardy? I like Jeopardy. Let's do Jeopardy. So here we go. Now, with Jeopardy, you have to do what? Your response has to be in the form of a question. All right, so here's the answer. The experience of feeling hopeless, helpless, and powerless. What is parenting? No. What is trauma? All right, 3 words I don't want you to forget. Hopeless, helpless, and powerless. This is what defines trauma. This is what kids that go through neglect, when kids, again, medical trauma, you're powerless and you hurt. There's pain. Kids in an orphanage, there's no help available. They are helpless. Kids who have been left in a crib to cry. Kids who have no food. And so you start living in a world where you're going to make sure that never happens again. How many of you all have kids that are adamant that nobody will be in charge of them ever? And they're like 2, right? Because they've had an experience of being powerless. And in order to get back to a place of survival and to ensure that those experiences will not happen again, you see kids then that take charge. Or some kids just shut down. They get so hopeless, even when you move them into a loving family system. And they've been out of the trauma for years. They still have this switch that the minute they get overwhelmed, they just collapse and they just quit, right? How many of y'all have kids that just quit at any sign of challenge? Now, if you're type A and you have a kid that just shuts down and quits, I'm thinking you got some issues going on in the home, right? Because that's not within your framework. You take challenges on. It builds your fire. But you have a kid, though, that had a history of hopelessness, and so they just switch right back there at the sign of any challenge. So looking at how this is trauma, and I could spend I would the whole day talking about trauma because it's so important to recognize. I don't care if this child has been in your home 10, 12 years. This is part of their history. It's part of the past, but it's part of what they're living out of in their mindset. So let me just give you a list, and these are on your handouts. What that history looks like. Billy and Andy are different. So Andy, he had what? Nurturing, gentle physical touch, emotional availability. The list goes on. Physical needs met, consistency, stability. These are so important to a child and the way that they learn to navigate into the world. Now we have Billy, who may have had several of these, maybe one of these. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, adoption. Adoption is trauma. I mean, I'm an adopted parent. I'm an adoption advocate. But adoption is trauma. Some of you all mentioned that you have children that were adopted at birth or 1 or 2 weeks after birth. And we've never, I think, really recognized how traumatic that is from the child's perspective, because that child at birth has lost everything he knows about the birth mom. That's his first connection. His primal connection is with his mom. That's what all of our first primal connection is, with the mother. And so this is a child who's lost the smell of the mother, the voice of the mother, the heartbeat of the mother, and you place this baby into another mother's and father's arms, which are loving, great family, and everyone thinks this is wonderful. And it is, from the parent's perspective, absolutely. But have we stopped to say, what does this feel like for the child? That child does have feelings. That child can't, just because they can't say, hey, I'm a little stressed out right now because I'm never going to see my mom again. Can you help me out? They don't have a voice to that. And that's the other thing, powerlessness. They don't have a voice to it. So we have to recognize, again, I'm an advocate for adoption, so don't take that negatively. But again, from the child's perspective, it is part of why so many kids that I've worked with on my caseload, some of the most severe and most intense kids from the behavioral standpoint are the ones adopted at birth. Again, more of the history. Easy birth, sensitive caretaking, responsive parents, needs are met. There's safety and security in the home, emotional safety and security as well, predictability, good health. And then Billy, the list goes on. There could be an incident of just an accident that happened. You look at the list, and what I want you to do is really, if you're a professional and you're looking at a family, to always look at the history. Never underestimate that. I worked with a biological family, had a 7 and 8-year-old, and the 8-year-old was fairly okay, but the 7-year-old was off the scale, off the charts. I mean, her behavior, she was aggressive. She was spreading feces on the walls. I mean, she was really out there, and she was a biological child, and they've been to therapist after therapist, professional after professional, and I said to the mom, I said, well, what was conception like through the 9 months? And she goes, well, no one's ever asked me that. And I said, well, that may have a very big impact on what this 7-year-old is going through, because what I found out was that the marriage was a mess. They were under a lot of stress. Dad was about to leave. They were financially in despair. And so mom was completely stressed out during this pregnancy, ended up having a very difficult birth experience. And so what had happened to that child then, that the child's nervous system had just been switched at a higher level, and they'd been programmed to come out into the world basically kicking and screaming, because that's what they experience in those developmental 9 months of the fetus developing. So again, very important to look at that history. So let's take a look. A kid that's left crying and not cared for. He's calling out for help. This is a child every child is programmed to be egocentric, because that's about connection. That's about, I can't take care of myself, I need you. And when those needs are met, the child eventually will just shut down the body system, because if a child is in that kind of heightened stress for too long, they'll die. And so there is a part of the bodily system that shuts down in order to get the body to calm back down. Now, that is not something that happens at the emotional level, feeling safe. It's an automatic trigger out of survival to be able to calm down. This is why it's very important. I mean, if you look at attachment parenting, not on the back end of it, but the frontal piece of looking at how do you raise children from an ability to calm their nervous systems, more that attachment perspective, it's very important to meet our kids' needs. And when we understand that they didn't have their needs met, this is what causes a lot of the issues. We've got kids who are physically abused. And you may not have seen what happened to your kids. You may have read the reports. But I put these pictures up not to be dramatic, but to make sure that we never forget either. It doesn't mean it's an excuse for our kids, but it means that we have to understand we're not raising Andy. To expect your little Billy to be like Andy is unfair. It's not who he is or she is. And so we have to start accepting that we do have a child with special needs. And I think, that internal piece as a parent, I had a Q&A yesterday of a mom was interested in signing up for my mom's conference. She said most of her grief was about not having her dream family. She didn't have little Andy. She thought she was signing up for little Andy. Now she's got Billy. And so it is about that acceptance in our own heart and soul of who we're raising. And not expecting our little Billies to be Andy. Maybe your child came from an orphanage. How many of you all have internationally adopted kids? And you're like, well, it was a good orphanage. There is no good orphanage. An orphanage is not a place for a child. That's why we don't have orphanages here. How many of you all were also told that your kids were the favorite at the orphanage? Because everyone's told that, right? My kids were the favorite at the orphanage. So an orphanage is an orphanage, and we have to, again, recognize that that is not the environment to have what Andy had. And then maybe you're like, well, he was only in the orphanage for 9 months, or she was only in 9 months of this, where needs are not met, they're not cared for, and it's not to be critical of orphanages. They are doing the best they can. But again, from whose perspective? The child's perspective. Not to have that one-on-one connection, that one-on-one relationship where needs are met and stability is there, and the continual attention to help calm that child down. And of course, medical trauma. Is there a piece in that child's medical history where they've been separated from the parent? And the hospitals do a really good job now of trying to keep the relationship going, but still, that's a piece in their history. So we continue to look all the way back to pregnancy. This is a baby who was baked in cortisol within the womb. All right, so I definitely just encourage you to keep that perspective, to understand who Billy is. Again, that word understanding is what we're going to be working on today.